Hey guys, it's Mr. Daigle. We're going to go ahead and get started on a time of violence. You like my little beads? It's getting close to Valentine's Day, and my first grader decided that I needed to be prettied up a little bit. I don't know. Look at this face. I don't know if you can get much prettier than that, but I guess we'll see what we can do. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 6: A Time of Violence. The stage is set for violence. King Louis XVI was angry that the new National Assembly refused to disband, and he was nervous. So nervous that he no longer even trusted his own French troops. He had Swiss guards brought in from the outskirts of Paris into around the closer parts to the city instead of just out in the rural countryside. And really, the reason why is, I mean, who made up the most of the French military? It was the Third Estate. And so he did not trust them. There, that's your first answer right there. It says, who did King Louis the 16th bring to protect him? It was the Swiss guards. But the second question says, why does Louis XVI not trust his French troops? Like I said, they were mostly part of the Third Estate. Obviously, they had loyalties to the king, but they also had family who would have been rioting themselves. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up here. Okay. The people of Paris and the deputies of the National Assembly were alarmed. Rumors started to fly. What was the king planning to do with these troops? Would he arrest the deputies of the Third Estate just when they might make some changes? Maybe get a little freedom and relief from the overwhelming tax burdens. Was the king going to stop them now? On July 8th, one of the strongest leaders of the new assembly spoke out angrily. He said that all of these troops arriving in Paris every day were preparations for war. The members of the assembly should not sit quietly and watch this happen, he argued. And here's a picture of Louis XVI. Louis XVI, I think a lot of times what's unfortunate is he gets a bad name. A lot of times people say, oh, he was not an intelligent man, or he was a little soft. And he really wasn't. He was, especially when it came to finance, he was a very bright man. He just was not an absolute monarch type material. Absolute monarchs have to rule absolutely, and they can't just rule being soft. And Louis XVI was not one like his grandfathers and his great grandfathers before him, who could rule cruelly. Louis XVI did not do this. And believe it or not, ironically, that was his downfall. All right. Okay. In Paris, the working class, or the sans-culottes, they grew more alarmed and angry. Because of the failing economy, 150,000 Parisians out of a population of about 600,000, which is roughly 25%, okay, they were out of work. Bread had been in short supply for several months, and the prices had risen so high that a single loaf could cost as much as a half a day's pay. Imagine that today. Imagine your parents, they make $100 a day, and then you have to buy bread and it's $50. That better be some good bread. Because of these outrageous prices, many people went hungry. Working people were convinced that aristocrats and grain supplies were withholding grain grain suppliers were withholding grain to force the price of bread to go even higher. Then on July 12th, the king made another mistake. This is a big one. He actually fires his finance minister, Jacques Necker, who had encouraged Louis to give in to the Third Estate's demands. One thing that your book doesn't say, but Jacques Necker was actually part of the Third Estate. He was bourgeois, and he was sympathetic to the plight of the Third Estate. Now, the king had gotten rid of Necker and was organizing his troops. People thought that the king, under the influence of the queen and the nobles at court, would use force to disband the National Assembly and take back all that they had gained. With such rumors flying around, it's no wonder that angry mobs roamed the streets, breaking into shops, looting and grabbing weapons and threatening the homes of the wealthy, and stealing bread from bakeries. The stage was set for the first and most famous outbreak of violence in the French Revolution. To the Bastille, monsieur! To the Bastille! All right, and then one of your questions here, number 4, says, "What was this big mistake that he made on July 12th?" And like I said, like I just read, was Jacques Necker. Firing him was not a smart move at all. He probably listened a little too closely to some of his advisors who were saying, "Oh, no, 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 you got to get rid of him. He's too sympathetic to the Third Estate." So King Louis XVI goes, "Oh yeah, sure, that's a good idea." Gets rid of him. Not a good idea. To the Bastille, or the Bastille. This was an old fortress from the 1300s with stone walls, 5 feet thick, and also 8 stone towers. There was a moat that surrounded the outer wall. A drawbridge led to the entrance. An inner court was protected by a second moat and drawbridge. The Bastille was the object of legend and mystery to most Parisians. It was rumored that men were chained in secret dungeons. Actually, the Bastille held only 7 prisoners on July 14th, 1789. There were even more plans to have the prison demolished, but to the Parisians, it represents tyranny of the Bourbon kings. So think about this. Imagine if you're a Parisian living in the city, and every day you wake up and you see this big, huge old fortress. And you know inside that big, huge, old, stinky fortress that it's holding people who have spoken out against the crown. So every day you look at that thing, and what does it represent? It represents tyranny. It represents absolute monarchs who will not listen to the people. So yes, there was a lot of resentment there. Bernard de Launay, governor of the Bastille, was, according to one of his officers, without much knowledge of military affairs, without experience, and without much courage. So imagine somebody working for you that says, "Okay, he doesn't know a lot about the military, he doesn't have any experience, and he has no courage." It doesn't sound like the way I would want to be described. On the morning of July 14th, the sky was heavy with dark rain clouds. Launay walked the Bastille's ramparts, the tops of the high walls, thinking about the reports he had heard of riots throughout the city overnight. The Bastille was manned with 82 elderly soldiers. Think about this. Okay, 82 old men, probably having retired from the military, or maybe they were probably still in the military, but too old to go and do anything physical. So they're sitting around inside this old political prison. Plus, they have 32 Swiss guards. Stockpiled inside were 250 barrels of gunpowder that had moved to the Bastille for safekeeping. There were numerous cannons and smaller guns. The drawbridges were pulled closed. Launay was ready for trouble, or so he thought. That morning, rioters had broken into a storage facility where the army's weapons were kept. The crowd takes, listen to this, folks, 30,000 muskets, and they carry off cannons stored there. But they had no gunpowder and only a handful of bullets. Then the rioters learned that the gunpowder had been moved to the Bastille. The shout went up, "Let's go to the Bastille, to the Bastille, monsieur!" From his window in the Bastille, Launay could hear them approaching. Had to be really scary. When the rioters arrived at the Bastille, they saw walls bristling with cannons. They were convinced that the cannons were going to be used to attack the city, not simply just to defend the Bastille. An official delegation went to Launay and said, "Hey, please remove the cannons and give up the fortress to the citizen soldiers." Well, Launay agrees, "Okay, I'll take the cannons down, but I'm not giving up the Bastille." As news of the crisis spreads, more and more sans-culottes joined the crowd outside the Bastille. Several men broke the pulleys holding the drawbridges, And the crowd surged into the courtyard where there was a second set of drawbridges. Shots rang out from the crowd and from the soldiers on the ramparts. The crowd shouted, "Down with the bridges." One thing that your book doesn't tell you, but what actually happened here is when the delegation was meeting with Launay, and they were asking him to make some of these concessions, the delegation never had time to go back and report to the other sans-culottes, "Hey, he'll take down the cannons, but he won't give up the Bastille." They never made it in time to tell them that. So we don't know if the other people would have said, "Okay, well, if they take the cannons down, we'll give them a break." We'll never know, because that never got to that point. Eventually, and also the guys who broke down the pulleys literally scaled the front side of the Bastille and went down behind it, and then busted the pulleys. The book sort of makes it sound like they did it from the outside, but no, they literally had to go up and over and inside to get to the pulleys. An official delegation went to Launay to ask him to remove. Oh, never mind, I read that. Second set of trumpet. Okay, I read that too. Eventually, realizing the resistance was useless, Launay opens the gates. Crowds of armed men immediately surged into the prison, taking soldiers and Swiss guards captive and freeing the 7 prisoners. Launay was taken prisoner, but his guards could not protect him from the angry mob. Before he could reach safety, Launay was brutally killed. And this book doesn't elaborate, but it was pretty brutal. Along with another defender. Many people were horrified at the savagery of the mob, but to many, the fall of the Bastille was the true beginning of the revolution. And then here's another picture, famous painting of the Bastille. Another fact that the book does not say is when they take the Bastille, it literally takes them 3 days. They tear apart the Bastille brick by brick. No cannon fire, nothing like that. They literally pull it apart. And a lot of those bricks that had held the Bastille together were literally used and taken into different parts of Paris and used to build other homes or fix walls and things like that. The morning after the fall of the Bastille, King Louis was awakened early with the news. "Is this a rebellion?" he asked the official who had brought him the news. "No, sire, this is a revolution," was the famous reply. Strangely, the king wrote the following journal entry the next day, "Rien," which means nothing. So in other words, it was not that big of a deal. Nothing worth getting excited over. So with my journal, I'm not gonna make much of a mention over it. The Great Fear. Necker, the finance minister whose firing had triggered the riots, was returned to office 2 days later. But rioting and violence continued. In Paris, 2 of the king's officials were attacked and killed by a mob in a particularly gruesome manner. The violence spread throughout the countryside. A poor harvest in 1788 had caused a shortage of grain. Bread was in short supply in the countryside, as well as in the cities. Peasants attacked millers who were accused of hoarding grain. They destroyed fences and walls on the estates, killing the animals in the private forests of the nobility. They broke into the manors where nobles lived. Sometimes they even killed the manor lord and his family. Some nobles decided to flee France and settle in other countries. They were called the émigrés. Now, we're reading parts of Tale of Two Cities, and we're watching the movie. In it, Charles Darnay, who was once upon a time Charles Saint Evermond, literally leaves his title and all of his money, and he immigrates to England. Well, he was an émigré. Okay. Now, in the book, of course, this was like 5 years before this all starts, but a lot of people follow his cue, and they literally flee France before this great terror actually takes hold throughout the country. Another thing that they mention here is that a lot of the animals were being killed in the private forests of the nobles. Well, at that time, you had to have permission from the nobles to hunt their property, because all game gaming and wildlife, fishing, all of that belonged to the king, to the monarchs. Okay, you had to have special permission. As the violence continued, a period of confusion and panic. Here it is, one of your questions here, known as the Great Fear, swept the countryside. And what was the Great Fear? Basically, this gives you the answer right here. It says wild rumors spread that bands of violent ruffians, British troops and Spanish troops, in pay of the nobility, in other words, they were like mercenaries, were roaming the countryside, burning crops, murdering peasants. And in a panic, the peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find, knives, pitchforks, hoes, and they hid in the forests and the caves. Really, this time, it was a lie. None of that stuff was actually happening. But hey, listen, we know how fast lies can spread through social media today, right? Well, imagine back then when all of this was passed through word of mouth. Somebody might say, hey, I heard, in the next village over, there were these Spanish brigands and they were killing us poor third estate, us poor peasants. Well, it's causing fear. And the more fear, the more anger. And the more anger, the more violence. When the murdering gangs failed to materialize, the fear passed as quickly as it had appeared. What they're saying is, it says they failed to materialize. They're saying they never found any evidence of any of that actually really happening. So the fear passes as quickly as it appears. But the people continued rioting. In villages, the king's officials abandoned their offices. They were replaced by middle-class mayors and officials that were friendly to the revolution. Central authority was breaking down. Here's one of your questions right here. The militia did not help because most of its members sympathized with the rioters. Okay, so these people who held offices like sheriffs and mayors and maybe tax collectors were once upon a time friends to the Second Estate. Guess what? They're getting chased out of there and they're being replaced by people in the Third Estate. And those people in the Third Estate are going to be on the side of the revolution. In Versailles, the National Assembly was in session, working on reforms and a constitution. News of the summer's riots and looting alarmed the deputies. A duke, who was one of the richest nobles of the land, spoke to the assembly. Now, here, I wish they would say here, but they don't say this before we're going into this quote, so I'm going to say it for you. He was sympathetic to the revolution. So when he says this next quote, listen to it closely, because it's actually in support of the revolution and not in support of the aristocracy. He says, in several provinces, what for us that would be like states or different regions of the country, in several provinces, the whole people form a kind of league for the destruction of the manor houses. You remember the houses of the nobility. The ravaging of the lands, and especially for the seizure of the archives where the title deeds to feudal properties are kept. It seeks to throw off at least a yoke that has for many centuries weighted it down. What they're saying here is the people on the countryside, they were going around to these tax offices and to these assessors and taking any kind of deeds that they could find, any type of land titles, and they were destroying them. They were destroying all of these feudal titles. Why were they doing that? Well, we know what feudalism, all the way back to fourth grade when you guys studied feudalism, we know that if you were serfs or peasants, you couldn't even own land, that these feudal lords owned all of the land. Well, if you destroy all of the evidence of who owns what, then maybe, I guess, in the mind of the people who are doing the destroying would start things afresh. Maybe they would have more of a chance to own. The question that faced the National Assembly now was what to do about the violence. You have a question on here, and the question says, on number 13, it says, what do you think the people of France, or why do you think that the people of France had become so violent? It says, why do you think? Okay, so I want you to answer that. I want you to see what's going on, and that question it's looking for an implied implied information, okay? In other words, it's not going to be explicitly written in your chapter, but use your noodle and figure that one out, okay? And then the last question says, predict what you think the National Assembly will do to end the violence in France. It's saying it wants you to predict. It's not saying that there's a specific identified answer, okay? So you are going to predict what you think is going to happen. How would you possibly try and stop this violence in France? Guys, that's your whole chapter. If you have any questions, you can always email me, and a lot of you already do. So those of you who haven't, now's your chance. Have a great day. Bye-bye.